Imagine walking through the administrative heart of Imperial Beijing, past government offices where clerks stamp documents and tax collectors count coins. You notice a building with no sign, no imperial dragons, nothing to announce its purpose, just weathered wooden doors that have been polished smooth by countless hands. But step inside, follow the corridor as it bends away from the street, and the air changes. Wood polish gives way to something sharper, the mineral smell of stone that never quite dries, and underneath it all, something that makes your stomach clench. This was the Board of Punishment's prison, where the Qing dynasty perfected the bureaucracy of torture. Not hidden in some remote fortress, but tucked between a records office and a tax bureau, so close to the machinery of government that screams could drift through the walls like the scratch of a clerk's brush on paper. Here's what makes this place historically unique. Under Qing law, confession was the only key that could unlock conviction. No confession, no trial. No admission of guilt, no punishment. Which meant this building existed for one purpose: extraction. The methodical process of taking whatever story lived in a suspect's mind and replacing it with something the state could use. The tools they used have names that became synonymous with imperial justice: Zanji, the finger crusher; Jagun, wooden boards tightened with hemp cords until bones began to crack, devices so precisely engineered that they could apply excruciating pressure without causing death. Usually. Today, we're opening the sealed files on China's most sophisticated torture facility. We're going inside the interrogation chambers where pain became paperwork, where truth was less important than closure, where the state turned human suffering into administrative efficiency. This isn't just another history lesson. This is forensic archaeology of institutional horror. If you're ready to explore the darkest corners of imperial power, hit that like button and join our community of history investigators. Because some stories can only be told when we're brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. In the administrative heart of the Qing Empire, where inkwells held more power than armies and rubber stamps could seal a man's fate, there stood a building that bore no sign. No carved characters announced its purpose. No imperial dragons adorned its threshold. Just a doorway, weathered smooth by countless hands, leading into corridors that smelled of wet stone and fear. This was the prison of the Board of Punishments, not a fortress on some distant hill where criminals might rot in romantic obscurity, but a backroom annex to governance itself. So close to the desks and seals of empire that a scream from the interrogation chamber could drift through the walls like the scratch of a clerk's brush on paper, so integrated into the machinery of state that torture became just another form of paperwork. The year was somewhere in the late 17th or early 18th century, when the Qing dynasty had settled into the comfortable rhythm of absolute power. Beijing sprawled around the forbidden city like a vast organism, its arteries pumping bureaucrats and petitioners and the endless flow of imperial business. And somewhere in that organism, tucked between a records office and a tax collection bureau, sat this particular building where the state did its most intimate work. You could walk past it 100 times and never guess. The exterior walls were the same gray brick as every other government building, the same curved roof tiles, the same wooden shutters painted in regulation colors. But step through that unmarked door, follow the corridor as it bent away from the street noise, and the air would change. Wood polish gave way to something sharper, the mineral smell of stone that never quite dried. And underneath it all, something that made your stomach clench, the scent of fear absorbed into timber and mortar like incense into temple walls. Because this building existed for one purpose, and that purpose was written into the very foundations of Qing law. Confession was the key that made conviction possible. Not evidence in the sense we might understand it, not witnesses or forensic proof or careful investigation. Words. Spoken words. The sound of a human voice admitting guilt, recorded by a careful clerk, filed in triplicate, and stamped with the authority of the Son of Heaven. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Order depended not on what actually happened, but on what people were willing to say had happened. Truth was less important then closure. And closure meant that somewhere in this building, in these rooms that smelled of damp and desperation, mouths would open and words would pour out, and the great machinery of justice would lumber forward on the strength of those admissions. So the real purpose of this place wasn't custody, though it held prisoners. It wasn't punishment, though suffering lived in every corner. It was extraction. The careful, methodical process of taking whatever narrative lived in a suspect's mind and replacing it with something the state could use, something that fit the templates, something that could be written down and filed away and forgotten. The corridor stretched ahead, lit by oil lamps that cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. The wooden floor had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps, guards escorting prisoners, clerks carrying documents, officials making their rounds. Each step had polished the boards a little more until they reflected the lamplight like dark water. And at the end of that corridor, behind doors that had been reinforced with iron bands and fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside, lay the tools of the trade. The tools were already laid out, as they always were, cleaned and oiled and arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments, because what happened here was, in its way, a form of surgery, the careful removal of one story and its replacement with another, the amputation of inconvenient truths and the grafting on of more useful fictions. And like any surgery, it required the proper instruments. Imperial logic flowed through this building like blood through veins. Order depended on admissions, not evidence. Stability required that every crime have its confession, every disturbance its explanation, every deviation from the norm its official acknowledgement. The mouth had to say it. The voice had to break. The will had to bend until it shaped itself around the words the state needed to hear. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't the random cruelty of bandits or the passionate violence of blood feuds. This was bureaucracy. Clerks arrived at appointed hours. Forms were filled out in triplicate. Procedures were followed with the same attention to detail that governed tax collection or military recruitment. A system optimized for closure, fine-tuned over decades to produce the one thing that mattered most in the imperial worldview: official, documented, indisputable admission of guilt. The chain began at arrest and moved with mechanical precision. Guards brought suspects from the street or from their homes or from wherever the long arm of imperial authority could reach. Runners carried paperwork between offices, ensuring that every transfer was documented, every movement recorded. Jailers logged arrivals and departures with the same careful notation used for grain shipments or silk inventories, and at the end of that chain sat the interrogation room, where the transformation occurred, where suspects became confessors, where silence became speech, where truth became whatever the state needed it to be. The clerks were perhaps the most crucial part of this machinery. Men who had spent years perfecting their brushwork, learning to write quickly and clearly under pressure. They sat at low tables just outside the interrogation chamber, inkstones and paper arranged within easy reach, waiting for the moment when their services would be required. When the screaming stopped and the talking began, when the pain had done its work and the real work, the work of documentation, could commence. Because that was the beautiful symmetry of the system. Pain was temporary, but paperwork was forever. A man might heal from his wounds, might even escape from custody, might disappear into the vast anonymity of the empire. But once his confession existed on paper, signed and sealed and filed in the proper office, it became part of the permanent record, part of the truth, part of history itself. A case file landed on the table with the soft thud of bundled paper. Inside, the usual collection of documents: arrest warrant, transfer orders, preliminary statements from witnesses. But at the bottom, a note written in the careful hand of a supervising clerk. Subject refuses confession. Standard instruments authorized. Standard instruments. The phrase carried the weight of regulation, the comfort of procedure. Nothing arbitrary here, nothing capricious, just the methodical application of tested techniques to a common problem. Because subjects who refused confession were indeed a common problem, and the state had developed common solutions. solutions that had been refined through practice, codified through experience, and reduced to a set of tools that could be deployed with bureaucratic efficiency. The most famous of these tools bore names that had become shorthand for imperial justice: zanji, the finger crusher; jiagun, the wooden boards tightened with cords. Devices that had been perfected through generations of use, their design shaped by the specific requirements of confession extraction. Not weapons of war designed to kill quickly and efficiently, not instruments of execution meant to deliver death with ceremonial gravity. These were tools of persuasion, machines for changing minds. The finger crusher was perhaps the most elegant in its simplicity. Thin wooden sticks, carefully shaped and smoothed, designed to fit between a man's fingers. Cords made from the finest hemp, chosen for their strength and their ability to hold knots under pressure. When assembled correctly, when operated by someone who understood the principles involved, it could apply precisely controlled pressure to the most sensitive parts of the human hand. Enough pressure to produce excruciating pain. Not quite enough to cause permanent damage. Not usually. The larger device, the jiagun, operated on similar principles but with greater leverage. Wooden boards, thick enough to distribute pressure evenly, fitted with a system of cords and pulleys that allowed the operator to compress whatever was placed between them with steadily increasing force. Arms, legs, torso. Anything that could fit between the boards could be subjected to the kind of pressure that made breathing difficult, made thinking impossible, made silence unbearable. These tools existed because the state believed pain was a truth filter. Feed a man's denials through the machinery of agony, and what emerged would be purified, cleansed of deception, refined into honesty. The theory was as elegant as the devices themselves. People lied to avoid consequences, but they told the truth to avoid pain. Increase the pain sufficiently, and truth would flow like water from a broken dam. But pain, as any experienced interrogator knew, was also a story generator. A man in agony would say anything to make the agony stop. He would confess to crimes he had never committed, implicate people he had never met, describe events that had never occurred. Pain didn't filter truth from lies. It created new lies, more compelling lies, lies spoken with such desperate conviction that they sounded like revelation. This was the central paradox of the system. The very tool designed to extract truth was also the most efficient machine for manufacturing fiction. But that paradox didn't matter, because truth and fiction were less important than closure. What mattered was that someone confessed. What mattered was that the confession fit the template. What mattered was that the paperwork could be completed, and the case could be closed, and the machinery of justice could move on to the next problem. A clerk dipped his brush in fresh ink and adjusted his position at the low table. Soon, very soon, he would begin writing. The suspect's name, age, place of birth, alleged offense, all the standard information required for a proper documentation. And then, when the real work began in the next room, he would begin transcribing the most important part of any case file: the confession narrative, the story of how a suspect became a criminal, the transformation of silence into speech, resistance into compliance, denial into admission. The architecture of the building reflected its function with the kind of thoughtless efficiency that characterized all imperial construction. Intake space near the entrance, where arriving prisoners could be processed without disrupting ongoing operations. Holding cells along one corridor, small chambers barely large enough for a man to lie down, fitted with heavy doors and minimal ventilation. The interrogation room at the far end, positioned for maximum sound isolation. And throughout the building, a network of smaller rooms for document storage, equipment maintenance, staff quarters. Every detail had been considered. The intake space had high ceilings to accommodate the chaos of arrival. Struggling prisoners, harried guards, boxes of paperwork that needed to be sorted and filed immediately. The holding cells had floors that sloped slightly toward central drains, making cleaning easier and more efficient. The interrogation room had thick walls and specially designed door frames that would muffle sound while allowing air circulation just sufficient to prevent suffocation. But it was the small details that revealed the true horror of the place. Ventilation systems that trapped odors rather than dispersing them, ensuring that the smell of fear and pain became part of the building's permanent atmosphere. Stone that held moisture, creating the kind of damp chill that seeped into bones and stayed there. Corridors designed with subtle curves and offsets that isolated sound, breaking up screams before they could carry to the street and draw unwanted attention. Because this wasn't hidden underground like some barbaric dungeon. This wasn't tucked away in some remote fortress where the state could pretend it didn't exist. This was adjacent to governance, integrated into the normal operations of imperial administration. Terror wasn't a secret here, it was policy. Pain wasn't an aberration, it was procedure. And the building's design reflected that integration, that normalization of horror as just another form of paperwork. A guard who had worked in the building for 15 years could describe every sound it made, the particular way footsteps echoed in the main corridor, depending on whether the person walking was wearing the soft-soled shoes of a clerk, or the heavier boots of a guard, or the wooden clogs of a prisoner. The different qualities of silence, the expectant hush before an interrogation began, the stunned quiet afterward, the empty stillness of the deep hours when even the rats seemed to hold their breath. But the worst sound, this guard would tell you if you could get him drunk enough to talk, wasn't the screaming. Screaming was honest. Screaming was human. It was the sound of a mind pushed beyond its limits, but still essentially intact. The worst sound was the moment just before the screaming began, when you could hear the cords starting to move, the small creaking of hemp against wood, the almost inaudible whisper of pressure being applied, degree by degree, until flesh could no longer bear the burden of silence. That was the sound that stayed with you. That was the sound that followed you home at night and crept into your dreams, because it was the sound of transformation, the exact moment when a person's relationship with truth began to change, when they started to understand that their previous definitions of honesty and deception were luxuries they could no longer afford, when they began to comprehend that words were not expressions of inner reality but tools for stopping pain. The work of the building proceeded with the rhythm of any other government office. Morning roll calls to ensure all personnel were present and accounted for, regular rounds to check on prisoners, document their condition, note any changes that might affect the quality of their eventual confessions, meal distributions calculated to maintain prisoners' health without making them comfortable, equipment inspections to ensure that all devices were clean, properly maintained, and ready for immediate use. But when the confession window opened, that portion of each day officially designated for interrogation, everything changed. The careful bureaucratic routine gave way to something more primal. Clerks sharpened their brushes and prepared fresh ink. Guards checked locks and tested restraints. And in the interrogation room, the tools were arranged with the precision of a ritual altar. Because what happened during the confession window was indeed a kind of ritual. A ceremony of transformation performed according to ancient scripts, with clearly defined roles for each participant. The interrogator, who would ask the questions and operate the devices with the detached professionalism of any skilled craftsman. The prisoner, who would eventually provide the responses that justified the entire proceeding. The clerk, who would transform the messy business of pain and capitulation into clean, readable text that could be filed and forgotten. And occasionally, when the case involved someone with connections or unusual circumstances, there might be witnesses, other officials whose presence would lend additional authority to the proceedings, whose signatures on the confession document would make it even more difficult to challenge later, whose participation would spread responsibility for what happened across a wider network of complicity, making it everyone's business and therefore no one's fault. The daily schedule was designed to maximize efficiency while maintaining the appearance of deliberation. Morning confessions were often the most productive when prisoners were weak from a night of poor sleep and minimal food, but still alert enough to provide detailed responses. Afternoon sessions allowed for follow-up questions, clarification of earlier statements, and the kind of fine-tuning that produced confessions of exceptional legal quality. Evening work was generally reserved for the most stubborn cases when natural fatigue could be combined with other forms of persuasion to break down the last barriers to cooperation. Between sessions, there was always maintenance to be done. Cords that had stretched under pressure needed to be replaced with fresh hemp cut to exact specifications. Wooden surfaces that had become stained or scarred needed to be cleaned and oiled until they looked as pristine as surgical instruments. Documents had to be copied, filed, and cross-referenced with other cases to ensure consistency in the growing database of confessions, because consistency was crucial to the system's legitimacy. Confessions that contradicted each other, or that included details that didn't match the established narrative of imperial order, could raise uncomfortable questions. Better to have a template, a standard format that could be adapted to individual circumstances while preserving the essential elements that made a confession legally useful. Better to have phrases that recurred across cases, language that had been tested in court and proven effective at securing convictions. A drawer in the clerk's desk held examples of particularly well-crafted confessions from previous cases, models that could be studied and emulated when current prisoners proved insufficiently articulate under pressure, because not every criminal was blessed with the verbal skills necessary to confess in proper legal language. Not every tortured mind could organize its capitulation into the kind of coherent narrative that judges preferred. Sometimes inspiration was required, sometimes guidance, sometimes the helpful suggestion of specific phrases that might expedite the entire process. This was the final refinement of the system, the recognition that confession, like any other form of official communication, could be improved through editing, that the raw material extracted from a prisoner's breaking will might need to be processed, polished, and formatted before it was ready for official consumption. That truth, properly understood, was less about accuracy than about utility, less about what actually happened than about what needed to be documented in order to close the case and move on to the next problem. The first case file processed through the new procedures would be remembered by clerks for years afterward. Not because of the crime itself, which was routine, a merchant accused of tax evasion who had been trying to argue his innocence based on technicalities of commercial law, but because of the confession that eventually emerged. A perfect example of the system working exactly as designed. The merchant had arrived defiant, clutching documents he claimed would prove his innocence. He had demanded to speak with supervisors, invoked the names of officials who supposedly knew about his case, insisted that his arrest was based on a misunderstanding that could be cleared up through proper investigation. He had maintained this position through the first interview, the second, and most of the third. But paperwork had deadlines, cases had quotas, and the confession window couldn't remain open indefinitely while one stubborn merchant delayed the entire schedule. So the standard instruments were authorized, applied with methodical precision, and within an hour the merchant was providing a detailed account of his systematic attempts to defraud the imperial treasury. Every technique he had used, every bribe he had paid, every official he had attempted to corrupt. Names, dates, amounts, all the information necessary to close not just his case, but several others that had been languishing in various stages of investigation. The confession filled 17 pages when it was finally transcribed. It implicated 12 other merchants, 6 low-level officials, and 2 guards who had allegedly accepted payments to ignore suspicious activities at border checkpoints. It described a network of corruption so extensive and so detailed that it would provide material for investigations lasting months. Most importantly, it was internally consistent, legally admissible, and absolutely convinced every official who read it. The merchant's signature at the bottom was shaky but legible. His fingerprint pressed into the red ink seal was clear and distinct, and the witnesses who had observed the confession being given all agreed that it had been provided voluntarily after appropriate questioning, in accordance with all relevant procedures and regulations. The paperwork was perfect. The case was closed. The system had worked exactly as intended. That the merchant died in his cell 3 days later was regrettable, but not unprecedented. That his original documents, which might have supported his claims of innocence, disappeared sometime during the transfer of his personal effects was unfortunate, but understandable, given the chaos that surrounded any prisoner's death, that his family received no compensation and his property was confiscated to pay the fines, and restitution detailed in his confession was simply the natural consequence of his acknowledged crimes. This was how the machine was supposed to work: smooth, efficient, productive, taking the messy business of human crime and processing it into clean, legal outcomes, converting resistance into compliance, silence into speech, innocence into admission of guilt. And at the center of it all, in that building with no sign, the tools waited, cleaned and oiled and ready, patient as priests, reliable as mathematics, effective as fear itself. Because fear, more than pain, was what the system actually ran on. The knowledge that resistance was temporary, but documentation was permanent. That a man might heal from his wounds but would never escape from his confession. That silence, however heroic, however principled, however justified, would eventually break. And when it broke, the only question would be whether the resulting words were shaped by cooperation or by agony. The finger crusher gleamed in the lamplight, its wooden surfaces polished to a warm glow. The cords lay coiled nearby, hemp fibers so perfectly braided they might have been decorative rather than functional. And on the small table beside them, a single sheet of paper waited to be filled with words that would transform a person into a case file, a life into a legal document, a human being into a problem solved. The confession process had been refined into an art form through decades of practice, not the crude brutality of battlefield interrogation or the passionate violence of personal vendettances, but something far more sophisticated. A delicate dance between pressure and release, pain and relief, despair and hope. Because the goal wasn't simply to break a person. Any fool with a club could accomplish that. The goal was to break them in precisely the right way, at precisely the right moment, so that what emerged from their shattered resistance was legally useful. The interrogation chamber itself reflected this sophistication. The walls were thick enough to contain sound, but not so thick as to create the oppressive atmosphere of a tomb. The lighting was carefully calibrated, bright enough for the clerk to see his work clearly, dim enough to create shadows that seemed to move and shift with every flicker of the oil lamps. The temperature was kept just cool enough to make prisoners uncomfortable without inducing the kind of violent shivering that might interfere with their ability to speak clearly. Even the positioning of furniture had been considered with scientific precision. The prisoner's chair placed at the exact distance from the interrogator's desk that made conversation possible without seeming intimate. The clerk's table positioned where he could observe everything but remain unobtrusive. A silent witness whose presence reminded everyone that this was official business, not personal vendetta. The tools arranged within easy reach but not immediately visible, creating an atmosphere of potential rather than explicit threat. Because the most effective torture, any experienced interrogator could tell you, happened in the imagination long before it touched the flesh. The knowledge that pain was available, that it could be applied at any moment, that resistance was not just futile but actively counterproductive. This psychological pressure often accomplished more than hours of physical coercion. A man who knew he would eventually break anyway might choose to save himself the suffering and cooperate immediately. This was considered the mark of an intelligent prisoner, someone who understood the mathematics of his situation and made the rational choice. The mathematics were indeed quite simple. Every person had a breaking point, some threshold of pain beyond which coherent thought became impossible, and the only imperative was making the agony stop. The interrogator's job was to find that threshold as quickly and efficiently as possible, preferably without causing damage that might interfere with the prisoner's ability to provide a detailed confession. This required skill, experience, and a kind of clinical detachment that could assess a person's psychological and physical limits with the precision of an engineer calculating load-bearing weights. Some prisoners broke quickly, merchants and scholars mostly, people whose lives had been comfortable enough that they had never developed tolerance for serious discomfort. Others required more intensive persuasion. Soldiers, sometimes, criminals with previous experience of official interrogation, religious fanatics whose faith provided them with frameworks for interpreting suffering as sacred rather than meaningless. But everyone broke eventually. This was not optimism but mathematics, as reliable as the movement of celestial bodies or the flow of rivers toward the sea. The confession window officially opened each morning at the hour of the snake, when the first natural light began to filter through the building's small windows. This timing was not arbitrary. Decades of experience had shown that prisoners were most vulnerable in the early morning, when a night of poor sleep and sparse rations had worn down their resistance, but they were still alert enough to provide coherent responses to questions. The body's natural rhythms, the interrogators had learned, could be as useful as any mechanical device in the work of breaking human will. The first case of the day involved a baker accused of adulterating flour with chalk and sawdust to increase his profits. A minor commercial crime, the kind of routine violation that kept the imperial courts busy with an endless stream of petty cases. But minor crimes required confessions just as much as major ones, perhaps more so, since the evidence was often circumstantial and the penalties relatively light. Better to have a clear admission of guilt than to waste time and resources on complex investigations that might not yield definitive results. The baker had initially claimed innocence, as most of them did. He insisted that any contamination in his flour was accidental, the result of poor storage conditions, rather than deliberate fraud. He produced witnesses who testified to his good character, customers who swore they had never noticed anything wrong with his products, suppliers who vouched for the quality of the grain they had sold him. A reasonable defense if the system had been designed to weigh evidence and determine truth through careful analysis. But the system was designed for confession, not investigation. And confession meant that someone's mouth had to open and the right words had to come out, regardless of what had actually happened. The baker's protests of innocence were noted in the record, along with his witnesses' statements, but these were preliminary matters. Documentation for the sake of thoroughness. The real work would begin when the confession window opened and the baker was brought to the interrogation chamber to provide his own account of his criminal activities. The interrogator began with the standard questions, delivered in the tone of a clerk taking inventory. Name, age, place of birth, occupation, details of family and residence. Basic information that established the prisoner's identity while also serving as a kind of warm-up exercise for both participants. The prisoner became accustomed to answering questions, to the rhythm of inquiry and response. The interrogator gauged the prisoner's mental state, his level of fear, his potential for cooperation or resistance. Then came the transition to more substantive matters. When had the baker first begun adulterating his flour? What materials had he used? Where had he obtained them? How had he concealed his activities from customers and inspectors? Questions that assumed guilt and demanded only the details of implementation. Not whether the crime had occurred, but how. Not if he was responsible, but why he had chosen this particular method of fraud. The baker's responses were predictable: continued denials, increasingly desperate protestations of innocence, appeals to justice and reason, and the possibility of mistake. Standard behaviors that every interrogator had seen hundreds of times before. Background noise that had to be endured before the real communication could begin. Because the real communication wouldn't start until the baker understood that his previous relationship with truth and falsehood had been permanently suspended. That words were no longer expressions of belief but tools for stopping pain. The finger crusher was brought out with the casual efficiency of a craftsman selecting the proper tool for a specific job. No drama, no theatrical flourishes, no attempts to intimidate through display. Just a device placed on the table where the baker could see it clearly, its wooden surfaces gleaming with the patina of long use, its cords coiled with mathematical precision. A machine waiting to be employed in the service of truth extraction. The baker's reaction was textbook: immediate recognition of what the device was and what it meant, followed by a burst of renewed protestations and promises. He would pay any fine, accept any punishment, provide any compensation the court deemed appropriate. He would close his shop, leave the city, never again engage in commercial activities of any kind. Anything except confess to crimes he insisted he had never committed. Anything except say the words that would transform him from a possibly innocent man into a definitely guilty one. But words were precisely what the system required, and the baker's willingness to accept punishment while maintaining his innocence was legally meaningless. Punishment followed confession, not the other way around. The machinery of justice couldn't move forward until someone admitted that justice was necessary, until someone spoke the narrative that would justify everything that happened afterward. The device was applied with the methodical precision that characterized all official procedures. The baker's hand positioned correctly, the wooden sticks aligned with his fingers, the cords tightened gradually to ensure even pressure distribution. Not the sudden crushing force that might cause immediate unconsciousness or permanent damage, but steady, increasing compression that allowed the full experience of pain to develop slowly, completely, unforgettably. The first scream came exactly when experience predicted it would, at the moment when discomfort transformed into genuine agony, when the body's pain management systems were overwhelmed, and the mind was forced to acknowledge that this was not something it could simply endure until it ended. The second scream was different, more desperate, carrying the beginning of understanding that this would continue until certain words were spoken. The third scream broke off suddenly as the baker tried to speak, tried to say something, anything, that might make it stop. But the interrogator was experienced enough to recognize premature capitulation, the kind of panic-driven submission that produced confused, contradictory confessions of little legal value. Better to maintain pressure a bit longer, to ensure that when the baker finally spoke, his words would be careful, detailed, and absolutely convincing to any official who might later review the case. Better to extract a confession that was complete the first time than to risk having to repeat the process because the initial results were inadequate. When the pressure was finally released, when the baker's hand was freed from the device and he sat sobbing in his chair, the interrogator asked the questions again. The same questions in the same tone, as if the previous 20 minutes had been a brief intermission rather than a fundamental alteration in the nature of their conversation. When had he first begun adulterating his flour? What materials had he used? How had he concealed his activities from customers and inspectors? This time the answers came in a steady stream, interrupted only by the baker's attempts to control his breathing and the occasional sob that escaped despite his efforts to maintain composure. Yes, he had been adulterating flour for approximately 2 years. Yes, he had used chalk and sawdust, purchased from a supplier outside the city who asked no questions about their intended use. Yes, he had developed techniques for mixing the adulterants in small quantities that would not be immediately obvious to casual inspection. The clerk's brush moved steadily across the paper, recording each admission with the calm efficiency of someone taking notes on grain shipments or tax collections. Name, age, occupation, details of the crime, methods employed, duration of criminal activity, estimated profits, names of accomplices, if any. Standard categories that could be filled in for any case, regardless of the specific details involved. But the most important part of any confession was not the factual information. Investigations could usually establish basic facts through other means if necessary. The most important part was the narrative of intent. The story that explained not just what had happened, but why it had happened. The psychological journey that had led a presumably law-abiding citizen to choose crime over honest work. This was what transformed a mere admission of facts into a legally useful confession, what made the difference between a statement that might be challenged and a document that could stand up in any court. The baker's narrative emerged slowly, shaped by the interrogator's questions and the clerk's understanding of what made confessions most effective. Economic pressure had driven him to seek additional profits through illegal means. Greed had overcome his natural honesty and fear of punishment. He had rationalized his crimes by telling himself that the adulterants were harmless, that his customers were not being seriously injured, that everyone in the trade probably used similar techniques, a progression from financial need to moral compromise to systematic fraud that any judge would find entirely believable. Most importantly, the confession included expressions of remorse and acceptance of responsibility that would make it difficult for the baker to later claim he had been coerced. He acknowledged that his crimes had betrayed the trust of his customers and damaged the reputation of honest merchants. He accepted that punishment was not only appropriate, but necessary to maintain order and protect the public from similar frauds. He expressed gratitude for the patience and fairness of the investigation that had uncovered his crimes and given him the opportunity to confess fully and honestly. When the confession was complete, when it had been read back to the baker and confirmed as accurate in all details, when his signature and seal had been applied to the final page, the case officially became a solved matter rather than an ongoing investigation. The baker would be transferred to the appropriate facility for punishment. His property would be evaluated for restitution payments. His name would be entered in the records as a convicted criminal. The machinery of justice would move on to the next case, the next prisoner, the next opportunity to transform denial into admission. The clerk carefully blotted the final page and added it to the growing stack of completed confessions that would be filed with the court at the end of the week. 17 cases closed in the past 5 days, 17 problems solved, 17 demonstrations of the system's efficiency and reliability. Each confession a small victory for order over chaos, truth over deception, proper authority over individual resistance to legitimate governance. But even as he filed the baker's confession with the others, the clerk couldn't help noticing certain patterns that had begun to emerge in recent months. Confessions that seemed almost too perfect, too complete, too neatly aligned with legal requirements. Stories that fit the standard templates so precisely that they seemed more like exercises in creative writing than genuine admissions of guilt. Details that recurred across different cases, as if multiple criminals had somehow been reading from the same manual of criminal methodology. This was not necessarily a problem. Consistency in confessions could be seen as evidence that the interrogation techniques were working as designed, that prisoners were being encouraged to tell the truth rather than concoct elaborate lies. But it did raise questions about the relationship between what actually happened and what the completed paperwork claimed had happened. Questions that were probably better left unexamined, since examining them too closely might interfere with the smooth operation of the system. Because the system worked, cases were solved, criminals were punished, order was maintained. The details of how cases were solved, how criminals were convinced to accept punishment, how order was maintained. These were technical matters best left to specialists who understood the complexities involved. The important thing was that problems got resolved, that the machinery of justice continued to function, that officials could report to their superiors that crime was being dealt with efficiently and effectively. A new case file arrived on the interrogator's desk before the baker had even been escorted back to his cell. A merchant accused of smuggling silk across provincial borders without paying the appropriate taxes. Another routine commercial crime. Another opportunity to demonstrate the system's effectiveness. Another chance to transform a possibly innocent person into a definitely guilty one through the careful application of pressure and the methodical extraction of useful words. The confession window remained open, the tools remained ready, the clerk prepared fresh ink and sharpened his brushes. Outside, Beijing continued its daily business, unaware of and uninterested in the small dramas playing out in the building with no sign. Inside, the work continued. Patient, methodical, efficient. The slow, careful business of turning human beings into case files, resistance into compliance, silence into speech. And in the wooden grain of the finger crusher, if you knew how to look, you could see the faint impressions left by hundreds of hands that had been placed between its surfaces. Marks worn into the wood by flesh and bone compressed beyond their natural limits, evidence of all the times the device had been used to extract truth from unwilling sources. A palimpsest of pain, written in microscopic scratches and barely visible indentations, telling the story of everyone who had ever learned that their relationship with truth was less important than their relationship with agony. The device itself was beautiful in its way. The wood had been selected from trees that grew slowly and developed dense, even grain that would resist splintering under pressure. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Joints fitted so precisely that they seemed to have grown together naturally, surfaces polished to a smoothness that felt almost warm to the touch. Even the cords were works of art, hemp fibers braided with such skill that they seemed to flow like water when handled properly. But beauty, like truth, was less important than function, and the device functioned perfectly, exactly as it had been designed to function, exactly as similar devices had functioned for generations, taking the messy, complicated business of human resistance and processing it into something clean and simple and legally useful, converting defiance into cooperation, pain into words, individuals into case studies in the reliability of imperial justice. The system was perfect because it was designed to be perfect, because every element had been tested and refined until it worked exactly as intended. The building that contained sound without creating claustrophobia, the tools that applied pressure without causing unnecessary damage, the procedures that extracted confessions without leaving obvious evidence of coercion, the paperwork that documented everything while revealing nothing that might prove embarrassing to review later. Most perfect of all was the logic that held everything together, the understanding that order required admission, that justice demanded confession, that truth was less important than closure. A logic so elegant, so complete, so resistant to challenge that it had sustained the system through decades of use and would probably sustain it for decades more. As long as people had secrets to hide and pain to avoid, as long as words could be extracted from unwilling mouths and recorded by patient clerks, the machinery would continue to function with clockwork precision. The confession window remained open, waiting for the next case, the next opportunity to demonstrate that resistance was temporary, but documentation was forever. That silence might feel heroic, but speech was practical. That in the end, everyone had a story to tell. They just needed the proper encouragement to tell it. The daily schedule at the Board of Punishment's prison began before dawn, with the sound of wooden clappers echoing through stone corridors. Guards moved through the building like clockwork figures, checking locks that had been checked the night before, counting prisoners who had nowhere to go, reviewing paperwork that documented the precise location and condition of every human being under their authority. This was not paranoia, but procedure. The kind of methodical attention to detail that kept large organizations functioning smoothly, even when their purpose was fundamentally chaotic. Roll call happened in the main corridor, where guards lined up in formation while a supervisor read names from a roster that was updated daily. Present, present, present. The rhythm of accountability that confirmed everyone was where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to do. Absent guards meant gaps in security, confusion in scheduling, potential problems that could cascade through the entire operation if not caught immediately. Present guards meant the machinery could continue to function with the precision of a well-maintained clock. After roll call came the morning feeding, a logistical exercise that revealed the institution's priorities with mathematical clarity. Prisoners received portions calculated to maintain basic health without providing comfort. Thin rice gruel with occasional vegetables, portions measured not by hunger, but by the minimum requirements for keeping a human being conscious and responsive. Guards received better food, served earlier and in greater quantity. Officials received the best food of all, sometimes brought from outside establishments that specialized in the kind of subtle cuisine that made long days in an unpleasant building more bearable. The feeding schedule also served as a form of crowd control, a way of moving prisoners through the building in manageable groups while minimizing opportunities for communication or coordination. Cell doors opened in sequence, prisoners emerged under escort, bowls were distributed and collected according to strict protocols designed to prevent the improvisation of weapons or the passing of messages. Even the timing was strategic. Prisoners who had been hungry all night were more likely to focus on food than on planning resistance or rebellion. But it was during the morning cell checks that the building's true character became most apparent. Guards moved systematically from door to door, noting the condition of each prisoner, checking for signs of illness or injury that might interfere with scheduled interrogations, documenting any changes that had occurred since the previous day's inspection. This wasn't medical care in any meaningful sense. It was quality control, the same kind of assessment that might be applied to livestock or inventory. The inspection process revealed details that outsiders might find shocking, but that guards had learned to treat as routine professional observations. Prisoners who had been interrogated recently often showed visible signs of their experience: swollen hands, difficulty breathing, the kind of trembling that indicated trauma too recent to hide. These conditions were noted in the daily reports with the same clinical detachment used for recording broken furniture or maintenance needs. More disturbing were the prisoners who showed no obvious signs of physical damage but whose eyes had acquired the particular emptiness that indicated successful confession extraction. These were the success stories, the cases where the system had worked exactly as designed. Men who had learned that resistance was pointless, that truth was negotiable, that words could be shaped to serve purposes entirely unrelated to accuracy or honesty. They sat quietly in their cells, spoke only when spoken to, and caused no administrative problems whatsoever. The morning inspection also served as an early warning system for potential difficulties later in the day. Prisoners who seemed agitated or defiant were noted for additional security measures during any scheduled interrogations. Those who appeared ill were evaluated for their ability to provide coherent confessions. Sick prisoners sometimes produced confessions of poor legal quality, rambling admissions that included irrelevant details or contradictory information that might prove embarrassing if reviewed by higher authorities. When the inspection was complete, when every prisoner had been seen and documented and assessed for his potential contribution to the day's work, the confession window officially opened. This was the signal for a subtle but unmistakable change in the building's atmosphere. Guards who had been carrying out routine maintenance tasks suddenly became more focused, more purposeful. Clerks who had been organizing paperwork began preparing fresh supplies of ink and paper. The interrogation chamber, which had stood empty during the morning activities, was prepared for its primary function. The preparation ritual was as standardized as any other aspect of the operation. Tools were removed from storage, examined for damage or wear, cleaned and oiled according to established procedures. The finger crusher and its larger counterpart, the wooden boards, were positioned at precise angles that allowed for maximum effectiveness while maintaining the appearance of clinical professionalism. Cords were inspected for fraying or weakness. Defective equipment could cause unpredictable results, either failing to apply adequate pressure or applying too much pressure too quickly. Most importantly, the documents were prepared, blank confession forms with standardized language that could be adapted to individual cases. Template phrases that had been proven effective in court. Reference materials that helped ensure consistency across different interrogations. Because the goal was not just to extract admissions, but to extract admissions that would be legally useful, confessions that would stand up to scrutiny and contribute to the broader project of maintaining order through documented accountability. The first case of the day was typically selected based on practical considerations rather than the severity of the alleged crimes. Prisoners who seemed most likely to confess quickly were often scheduled early, allowing the interrogation team to build momentum and confidence before tackling more difficult cases. Simple commercial crimes, minor theft, routine violations of tax regulations, these provided opportunities to demonstrate the system's efficiency while warming up for the more complex challenges that would follow. But this morning brought a case that would test the system's capabilities in ways that routine matters never could. A merchant accused of smuggling precious metals across provincial borders, but a merchant with connections, with family members in government service, with enough wealth to hire advocates who might ask uncomfortable questions about interrogation techniques. The kind of case that required not just confession, but confession that would be absolutely convincing to officials who might be predisposed to skepticism. The merchant's file was thicker than usual, filled with witness statements, financial records, correspondence that had been intercepted and analyzed for evidence of criminal activity. On paper, the case seemed solid. Transaction records that didn't match official customs declarations, testimony from border guards who claimed to have been approached with bribes, physical evidence in the form of precious metal ingots discovered during a search of the merchant's warehouse. But paper evidence, however compelling, was legally insufficient without confession. The merchant's mouth had to open and the right words had to come out. Initial questioning had yielded predictable results. The merchant claimed the transaction discrepancies were clerical errors made by subordinates whom he trusted too much. He insisted the border guards were lying, probably because they had been bribed by his business rivals to provide false testimony. The metal ingots, he maintained, had been planted during the search by corrupt officials who wanted to seize his property. A coherent defense strategy that might have been effective in a system designed to weigh evidence and determine truth through adversarial proceedings. But this system was designed for confession, and confession meant breaking down the merchant's carefully constructed explanations until he was willing to provide a simpler, more useful narrative, one that acknowledged guilt, accepted responsibility, and provided enough detail to justify the predetermined sentence while implicating any accomplices who might have escaped initial detection. The merchant was brought to the interrogation chamber under escort, his hands bound according to standard procedures, his movements carefully controlled to prevent any possibility of sudden violence or attempted escape. He was a middle-aged man who carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect, someone whose previous interactions with government officials had been conducted across desks in comfortable offices rather than in rooms that smelled of fear and damp stone. The interrogator began with the standard approach, questions delivered in the calm tone of someone conducting routine business. When had the merchant first begun smuggling precious metals? What routes had he used? Who had assisted him in evading customs inspections? Questions that assumed guilt and demanded only operational details, as if the conversation were about optimizing existing criminal activities rather than determining whether criminal activities had occurred. The merchant's responses demonstrated the kind of naive faith in procedure that characterized people who had never experienced the system's actual priorities. He continued to insist on his innocence, to demand evidence, to invoke his rights as a citizen and his connections to various officials who would supposedly intervene on his behalf if they understood the injustice being perpetrated. He seemed to believe that persistence and logic would eventually convince his interrogators that a mistake had been made. This was always the most tedious part of any difficult case, the period when prisoners still believed that their previous relationship with truth and falsehood would be honored, that words meant what they had always meant, that honesty would be recognized and rewarded. Experience had taught every interrogator that this phase was necessary but unproductive, a kind of psychological preparation that had to be endured before the real work could begin. The transition was marked by the appearance of the finger crusher, brought into the chamber with the casual efficiency that characterized all aspects of the operation. No dramatic presentation, no threats or explanations, just a device placed on the table where the merchant could see it clearly. A machine whose purpose was immediately recognizable to anyone who had heard the stories that circulated through Beijing's commercial districts, whispered accounts of what happened to people who refused to cooperate with official investigations. The merchant's reaction was exactly what experience predicted: immediate recognition followed by a burst of desperate negotiation. He would pay any fine, provide any information, accept any restrictions on his future business activities. He would voluntarily surrender his trading licenses, liquidate his assets, leave Beijing permanently if necessary. Anything except confess to crimes he insisted he had never committed. Anything except speak the words that would transform him from a possibly innocent man into a definitely guilty one. But the system required words, specific words, delivered in a specific sequence that would satisfy legal requirements and provide closure for the case. Financial penalties could be imposed after confession, not instead of confession. Voluntary surrender of assets could supplement official punishments, but couldn't replace the fundamental requirement that someone admit wrongdoing in clear, unambiguous language that could be documented and filed. The device was applied with a mechanical precision that had been perfected through countless similar procedures. The merchant's hand positioned correctly, the wooden components aligned for maximum pressure distribution, the cords tightened gradually to ensure that the full experience of pain developed slowly and completely. Not the sudden crushing force that might cause unconsciousness or permanent damage, but methodical compression that allowed every nerve to register the transformation of flesh into an instrument of persuasion. The progression was entirely predictable. Initial attempts to remain silent, to endure the pressure through force of will or commitment to principle. Then the first involuntary sounds, gasps and whimpers that indicated the body's pain management systems were being overwhelmed. Finally, the screams, desperate and increasingly incoherent, as the mind abandoned its previous priorities and focused entirely on the imperative of making the agony stop. When the pressure was released, when the merchant sat gasping in his chair with tears streaming down his face, the interrogator asked the questions again. The same questions, in the same tone, as if the previous 30 minutes had been a brief administrative delay rather than a fundamental alteration in their relationship. When had he first begun smuggling precious metals? What routes had he used? Who had assisted him in evading customs inspections? This time the answers came without hesitation, delivered in the kind of breathless rush that indicated complete psychological surrender. Yes, he had been smuggling precious metals for approximately 3 years. Yes, he had developed systematic methods for evading customs inspections, including regular bribes to border guards and the use of false documentation. Yes, he had worked with accomplices both inside and outside the government, and he could provide names, locations, and detailed descriptions of their activities. The confession that emerged over the following hours was a masterpiece of legal comprehensiveness. It included not only admissions of the specific crimes for which the merchant had been arrested, but also detailed accounts of related criminal activities that could serve as the foundation for additional prosecutions. Names of other merchants involved in similar schemes, details of corruption among customs officials, descriptions of smuggling routes that could be disrupted to prevent future violations. Most importantly, the confession included the kind of psychological narrative that made it legally unassailable. The merchant described his gradual descent from legitimate business practices to systematic criminality, motivated by greed and enabled by the corruption of others. He expressed remorse for his actions and gratitude for the thorough investigation that had uncovered his crimes. He acknowledged that punishment was not only deserved, but necessary to deter others who might be tempted to follow his example. When the confession was complete, when it had been read back and confirmed as accurate, when the merchant's signature and seal had been applied to every page, the case officially became a closed matter. The merchant would be transferred for sentencing, his assets would be seized for restitution, his accomplices would be arrested based on the information he had provided. The machinery of justice would move on to the next case with the satisfaction of having resolved another threat to imperial order. But success in individual cases was only meaningful in the context of larger quotas and performance metrics. The confession window remained open for additional prisoners, additional opportunities to demonstrate the system's efficiency and reliability. Because demand always exceeded supply, there were always more crimes to investigate, more suspects to process, more opportunities for the state to demonstrate its commitment to order through the methodical extraction of admissions. The daily schedule continued with mechanical precision. Escort rotations that moved prisoners between cells and interrogation chambers according to predetermined timetables. Document preparation that ensured confessions were properly formatted, copied, and filed for submission to higher authorities. Equipment maintenance that kept the tools of persuasion in optimal condition for repeated use. Each element of the schedule was designed to support the others, creating a system where efficiency was maximized and errors were minimized. Guards who knew exactly when and where they were supposed to be, eliminating confusion that could create security vulnerabilities. Clerks who had sufficient time to produce high-quality documentation without rushing through details that might prove important later. Interrogators who could focus entirely on extraction techniques without worrying about administrative complications. But perhaps the most important element of the daily routine was the evening review session, where supervisors evaluated the day's results and planned adjustments for future operations. Cases that had been resolved successfully were analyzed to identify techniques that might be applied to similar situations. Problems that had emerged during interrogations were discussed to prevent recurrence. Overall productivity was measured against established benchmarks to ensure the operation was meeting its institutional obligations. These evening sessions revealed the system's most sophisticated characteristic, its capacity for continuous improvement based on systematic analysis of results. Every confession was treated as a data point, every resistance technique as a problem to be solved. every procedural innovation as a potential enhancement to operational efficiency. The torture was never random or chaotic, but carefully calibrated to produce optimal outcomes with minimal waste of time and resources. The building settled into evening quiet with the same measured rhythm that marked all transitions in its daily cycle. Prisoners secured in their cells, guards posted at strategic positions, equipment cleaned and stored for the next day's use, documents organized and filed, reports prepared for submission to superior offices, plans made for the following day's schedule. Everything orderly, everything documented, everything prepared for the seamless continuation of operations. Outside, Beijing continued its own daily rhythms, unaware of and uninterested in the small dramas that played out behind the walls of the unmarked building. Merchants closing their shops, officials returning home to their families, clerks and craftsmen ending another day of routine work. The kind of normal life that was made possible by institutions like the Board of Punishment's prison, places where the messy business of maintaining order could be conducted away from public view. But inside the building, in the interrogation chamber where the tools waited cleaned and ready, the floor still bore faint stains that couldn't be completely removed by normal cleaning procedures. Dark patches that might have been spilled ink or water damage, but that guards knew were something else entirely. Evidence of all the times the system had worked exactly as designed, all the occasions when resistance had been converted into compliance through the careful application of pressure. The stains were a kind of archive, a record written in substances that no amount of scrubbing could entirely erase. Each mark represented a moment when someone had learned that their previous understanding of truth and falsehood had been permanently suspended, that words were no longer expressions of belief, but tools for stopping pain. Each dark patch was a small memorial to the system's effectiveness, proof that the machinery could convert any resistance into useful confession given sufficient time and proper technique. And in the growing darkness of the evening, as oil lamps were lit and guards settled into their night routines, the building prepared itself for sleep. Not the peaceful rest of a place where honest work had been completed, but the uneasy quiet of an institution that knew its function was necessary but not noble. A sleep interrupted by sounds that might have been rats in the walls, or wind through loose shutters, or something else entirely. Sounds that reminded everyone present that some kinds of work left traces that couldn't be completely erased, no matter how thoroughly the paperwork documented that everything had been done according to proper procedures. The confession window would open again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the system no longer needed to exist. Until crime was eliminated or confession was no longer required for conviction. Until someone discovered a more efficient method for converting resistance into compliance. But for now, in this building with no sign, the work continued. Patient, methodical, effective. The slow, careful business of turning human beings into case files, one broken hand at a time. The morning brought news that would test every procedure the institution had developed over decades of careful refinement. A policy directive had arrived during the night, delivered by a messenger whose horse was still steaming in the courtyard when the guards arrived for their dawn shift. The message was brief, written in the terse language that characterized all urgent communications from superior offices. No case leaves this week without confession. Quotas will be met. The quota system had always existed in unofficial form, an understanding that certain numbers needed to be achieved to demonstrate institutional effectiveness. But making it explicit, giving it the force of written policy, transformed it from administrative pressure into operational imperative. Guards who had previously applied torture techniques according to their professional judgment now found themselves working under deadlines that made careful calibration secondary to rapid results. The immediate effect was visible in the morning briefing, where supervisors outlined revised schedules designed to maximize throughput while maintaining the appearance of proper procedure. Interrogation sessions that had previously been allowed to develop at their natural pace would now be compressed into standardized time blocks. Cases that might have required multiple sessions to extract complete confessions would need to be resolved in single intensive procedures. The luxury of patience, which had always been one of the system's most effective tools, was suddenly unavailable. But time pressure created its own problems, complications that had been anticipated by institutional designers but never fully addressed. Rushed interrogations produced confessions of inferior quality, admissions that were legally sufficient but lacked the psychological depth that made them truly convincing. Prisoners who might have been gradually persuaded to provide detailed narratives of their criminal activities instead produced minimal statements that satisfied immediate requirements while leaving larger questions unresolved. More seriously, accelerated procedures increased the risk of permanent damage or death, outcomes that created administrative complications far more troublesome than simple delays. A prisoner who died during interrogation became a bureaucratic crisis that required extensive paperwork, investigations by superior authorities, and careful management of family members who might ask uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of their relatives' demise. The veteran guards understood these risks better than anyone, having witnessed enough cases where excessive pressure had produced counterproductive results. They knew that the finger crusher's effectiveness depended on precise calibration, that the wooden boards required careful monitoring to prevent crushing injuries that would interfere with a prisoner's ability to speak coherently. But they also understood that official policy now prioritized speed over precision, quantity over quality. The first casualty of the new quota system emerged during the second day of implementation. A farmer accused of hiding grain to avoid taxation had been subjected to an accelerated interrogation designed to extract a confession within a single session. The pressure had been applied too quickly, without the gradual build-up that allowed prisoners to understand their situation and make rational choices about cooperation. Instead of producing the desired admission, the procedure had resulted in unconsciousness, followed by cardiac arrest. The farmer's death created exactly the kind of administrative crisis that experienced personnel had feared. His family demanded to see the body, requiring careful preparation to minimize visible evidence of interrogation techniques. Local officials who had recommended his arrest now worried about their own liability if the case attracted scrutiny from higher authorities. Most problematically, the quota system still demanded a confession, even though the primary source of that confession was no longer available to provide it. The solution demonstrated the system's capacity for creative problem-solving even under difficult circumstances. The dead farmer's confession was constructed posthumously based on the partial statements he had made before losing consciousness and supplemented with details derived from the investigation that had led to his arrest. The document was carefully crafted to appear authentic while avoiding any specifics that might contradict physical evidence or witness testimony. The posthumous confession required careful coordination between multiple departments. Clerks had to backdate documentation to make it appear that the farmer had confessed before his death. Guards had to provide testimony confirming that the prisoner had seemed healthy and cooperative during his final interrogation session. Medical personnel had to certify that death had resulted from natural causes rather than interrogation-related injuries. Most importantly, the farmer's family had to be convinced that their relative had died peacefully after acknowledging his crimes and expressing remorse for his actions. This required delicate negotiations involving financial compensation for their loss, assurances that the farmer's remaining property would not be confiscated, and carefully crafted explanations for any physical evidence that might contradict the official narrative. The success of these negotiations depended largely on the family's economic circumstances and social connections. Poor farmers with no influential relatives were generally willing to accept official explanations in exchange for modest compensation and guarantees that they would not be subjected to additional investigations. Wealthier families or those with government connections required more extensive management, including the involvement of local officials who could apply appropriate pressure or inducements. But even successful management of individual cases could not address the larger systemic problems created by quota pressure. The quality of confessions continued to deteriorate as interrogators focused on speed rather than thoroughness. Administrative errors multiplied as clerks rushed through documentation that had previously been prepared with meticulous attention to detail. Equipment failures increased as devices that had been designed for careful, methodical use were subjected to intensive operational schedules that exceeded their safe operational limits. The building itself began to show signs of strain under the accelerated schedule. Ventilation systems that had been adequate for normal operations became overwhelmed by the increased frequency of interrogations, creating air quality problems that affected both prisoners and personnel. Drainage systems, backed up under the increased volume of cleaning required to maintain sanitary conditions. Even the structural elements began to suffer, as walls and floors absorbed moisture and odors faster than maintenance crews could address them. More subtle but perhaps more dangerous were the psychological effects on the staff. Guards who had previously taken pride in their professional skill at extracting confessions through carefully applied pressure now found themselves operating like factory workers on an assembly line. The intellectual challenge of matching interrogation techniques to individual prisoners was replaced by standardized procedures designed to produce rapid results regardless of circumstances. Clerks experienced similar demoralization as their roles shifted from careful documentation of complex legal proceedings to mass production of confession documents that often bore only minimal relationship to what had actually occurred during interrogations. The artistic elements of their work, the elegant calligraphy, the precisely formatted legal language, the subtle touches that marked high-quality official documentation, were sacrificed in favor of speed and volume. Even the interrogators themselves, the specialists whose expertise formed the core of the system's effectiveness, found their professional identity threatened by the new operational requirements. Techniques that had been developed through years of experience and refined through careful observation of results were abandoned in favor of crude applications of maximum pressure designed to produce immediate capitulation. The institutional knowledge that had made the system effective was being eroded by operational pressures that prioritized short-term productivity over long-term sustainability. Experienced personnel who understood the subtle relationships between pain, psychology, and persuasion were being forced to operate like crude torturers, whose only tool was the application of increasing physical pressure until resistance collapsed. This degradation of professional standards created a vicious cycle that threatened the entire operation. Poor quality confessions required additional follow-up work to address inconsistencies and fill gaps in the documented narratives. Equipment failures caused delays that put additional pressure on subsequent cases. Personnel turnover increased as experienced staff became frustrated with their inability to maintain professional standards. Most seriously, the increased frequency of deaths and serious injuries created security risks that extended beyond individual cases. Families who might previously have accepted official explanations for their relatives' treatment became suspicious when multiple deaths occurred in rapid succession. Local officials who had supported the prison's operations began to worry about their own liability if higher authorities decided to investigate the sudden increase in mortality rates. The corruption that had always existed within the system became more systematic and more visible under quota pressure. Guards who had previously accepted occasional bribes for minor favors now found themselves in a position to demand payment for basic services like food, water, and medical attention. Clerks who had sometimes overlooked minor inconsistencies in confessions for small fees now charged substantial amounts for the rapid processing required to meet deadlines. The marketplace that had always operated within the prison walls expanded to include new services specifically designed to help prisoners survive the accelerated interrogation schedule. Information about which interrogators were most susceptible to bribery, which guards could be convinced to provide advance warning of scheduled sessions, which clerks might be willing to prepare confession drafts that prisoners could memorize to speed their capitulation. But the most troubling development was the emergence of an internal economy based on betrayal rather than simple corruption. Prisoners who could provide information about their cellmates' potential confessions found themselves in a position to trade that intelligence for better treatment during their own interrogations. Guards who could identify prisoners most likely to resist interrogation could sell that information to supervisors looking to optimize their daily schedules. The system had always depended on fear and isolation to maintain control over its prisoners, but these new economic relationships created networks of communication and cooperation that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying institutional security. Prisoners who had previously been kept ignorant of other situations now had access to detailed information about interrogation techniques, confession requirements, and administrative procedures. More dangerous still was the knowledge that began to circulate about the specific details of quota requirements and deadline pressures. Prisoners who understood that their interrogators were working under time constraints could calculate optimal resistance strategies, timing their capitulation to maximize their chances of survival while minimizing the information they were forced to provide. The institutional response to these developments followed predictable patterns. Increased security measures designed to prevent communication between prisoners, including more frequent cell transfers and restrictions on common activities like feeding and exercise periods. Enhanced surveillance of staff to identify those most susceptible to bribery or other forms of corruption. Revised interrogation procedures that attempted to account for prisoners' improved understanding of the system's operational requirements. But each countermeasure created its own complications and unintended consequences. Increased isolation made prisoners more desperate and therefore more likely to attempt violent resistance during interrogation sessions. Enhanced surveillance of staff reduced their willingness to exercise professional judgment in difficult cases, leading to more rigid application of standardized procedures regardless of circumstances. Revised interrogation techniques required additional training and equipment that the institution was not prepared to provide under existing resource constraints. The building that had once operated with the precision of a well-maintained clock was becoming increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Equipment failures that had been rare under normal operating conditions became daily occurrences. Administrative errors that had previously been caught and corrected through careful review processes now accumulated into larger systemic problems. Personnel conflicts that had been manageable under previous working conditions escalated into serious disciplinary issues. The physical environment itself was deteriorating under the increased operational tempo. Stone walls that had been dry and solid began to show signs of moisture damage as drainage systems failed to keep pace with increased cleaning requirements. Wooden structural elements began to warp and crack under the stress of temperature and humidity fluctuations caused by overcrowding and poor ventilation. Even the specialized furniture and equipment began to show premature wear that threatened their operational effectiveness. In the interrogation chamber, where the most critical work was performed, the signs of institutional stress were most apparent. The finger crusher that had once been maintained in pristine condition now showed scratches and stains that couldn't be completely removed. The wooden boards used for larger-scale compression had developed hairline cracks that threatened their structural integrity. Even the cords that were essential to both devices had to be replaced more frequently as increased usage exceeded their designed operational lifespan. But perhaps the most ominous sign of institutional breakdown was the change in the sounds that echoed through the building's corridors. The measured rhythms that had previously characterized all activities were being replaced by irregular patterns that suggested disorder and haste. Footsteps that had once moved with purposeful precision now carried the urgency of people working under pressure. Voices that had maintained professional calm now carried notes of frustration and anxiety. The building was becoming louder, more alive with nervous energy, but also more dangerous. Prisoners who sensed the staff's growing desperation became more willing to take risks that they might not have considered under normal circumstances. Guards who were frustrated by their inability to maintain professional standards became more likely to resort to excessive force when faced with resistance. Clerks who were overwhelmed by documentation requirements became more careless about details that had previously been considered essential to operational security. And in the cells where prisoners waited for their turns in the interrogation chamber, conversations began to take on a different character. Whispered discussions that had previously focused on individual survival strategies now included speculation about collective action. Plans that had once been limited to individual escape attempts now encompassed coordinated resistance that could threaten the entire operation. The quota system that had been designed to increase institutional efficiency was instead creating the conditions for institutional collapse. The pressure that had been intended to improve performance was producing exactly the opposite result. transforming a sophisticated operation into a crude factory for manufacturing confessions of increasingly dubious quality and reliability.